Can you hear me? Good? All right. How's everybody doing tonight? It's definitely hot, isn't it? It's actually hotter up here. That thing doesn't really do a whole lot of difference because of this beautiful piece of art, I think. But it's a hot day. It looks like some of our regular church members are gone, but I was surprised to see this many on a Memorial Weekend like today. I figured there would be a lot of people gone, traveling and enjoying the beautiful weather. I got to say, one of the first things that came to mind today, and also when Dodo was making his comments on the weather, is that we truly live in a really amazing place. I mean, I think it's just a tremendous blessing for us to be able to live here in the state of Washington, in Seattle. And I mean, just look outside, it's just amazing. I really like the heat, Dodo, so I'm a little bit more on that side. I think it's something we've been looking for some time now, and I'm happy it's here. I'm hoping it's going to stay here through June too, Pete. I know Pete is shaking his head. He thinks June is going to be a gloomy, gray month, but I got faith that it's going to stick and it's going to be here through June. You know, this morning when I was doing a quick run, I do it every other day through the neighborhood, and I listen to songs when I do this, and I was just like, just really feeling overwhelmed with blessing and how amazing this place that we live in is. And my neighborhood is probably no more special than yours, so it kind of applies to all of yours, all of our lives, all of our spaces. And one of the songs that came on as I was running was the one that says, "You are a good, good father. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am, it's who I am." And for me, this was an amazing word and a song that really went so well with this feeling of overwhelming joy that I had, overwhelmed with the blessings, more blessings than really I deserve, and I know to thank God for. And, He is a good father. This is who He is. And me, I am loved by Him. That's a word that for some reason really resonated with me more than ever. This is who I am. This is the only reason I'm worth anything, because He loved me. Sometimes we struggle to figure out who we are. We try to figure out ourselves, and often we lose sight of who we're supposed to be, who He wants us to be, and who we can be in Him. But really nothing else matters other than the fact that He loved us and we are loved by Him. And I just wanted you to reflect a little bit and think about that song and those verses, and especially when you take in the beauty of this area and the blessings that we have and that we're surrounded with today. So, getting back to our series, we've started a series that I believe we're calling The Titans of Our Faith, a series that started a few weeks ago. And as you probably know, in previous sermons, in previous instances of this series, we learned how our relationship with our family and those immediately around us echoes and can affect our relationship with God. We learned about the sacrifice and brotherly love from the story of Cain and Abel. We learned just last week about Noah and the story of the great flood, and how Noah, against all odds, had faith in God regardless of what those around him were saying, and how he worked so hard to save his family from the heathen culture that they were living in during those times. Lots of learnings from those stories, and numerous applications for our daily lives. And I welcome and I encourage you to check your notes, or if you don't have notes, check the recordings that we do weekly here for the various sermons. And I want to take a moment just to thank Johnny and Manu and all the others that are involved in making these moments, streamable. We're taking full advantage of today's technology. And if you're not able to live stream it, I've done it in the past when I was traveling. You can go back and watch it. Watch the ones from previous instances. And it's just an amazing opportunity that today we have, again, going along with all these blessings that are part of our lives. So thank you, Johnny. Thank you, the team that's doing all this. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about Abraham. Abraham is a very complex character and has been covered by many famous and some less famous preachers like myself here. And there's a lot that can be said about him. There's a lot. He's a subject that really can be covered from many different angles, and lots of different learnings can be pulled out of him and his life. The title of my sermon here today is a little bit obvious, not super clever, but it really is the best way to think about Abraham and his life. And I've titled the sermon, Abraham, the Father of the Faithful. So first, I want you to open your Bibles or open the Bible app that is, most favored to you on your mobile platform of choice. And let's read two passages that we have for tonight. I'll be reading mine from the ESV, English Standard Version translation. And I was planning to read all of it, but in an effort of time, especially since I realized that it's going to be a busy night, I'm going to just read a few verses. First, from Genesis 12. We had from verse 1 to 9, but I'm going to read just the first three verses. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Continuing on, the rest of the verses go forward and explain much of how he came to be and the journey that he went through. But I want to read also a little bit from Hebrews. So Hebrews chapter 11, the whole segment for today's sermon is from verses 8 through 16. I'm just going to read a few of the first ones. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him to the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So, as I said earlier, these passages are a little bit long, probably longer than that really we should be spending time to read it right now, given the circumstances and the time. But I really encourage you to do read them both, so that you get a good understanding of the context here. Especially the New Testament passage in Hebrew is a very amazing explanation of Abraham's life, and almost self-explanatory, almost doesn't necessarily require any further preaching. My sermon tonight will really focus on just 3 points, and I pray that God will inspire me and fill me with His Holy Spirit so that I can share with you some of the things that I've learned about Abraham as I was putting this sermon together. So the 3 points that I will be covering will be, 1, faith changes lives. I'll speak a little bit about that and how what some learnings that I pulled out of Abraham's life. Number 2, faith is a journey. And last but not least, number 3, faith believes in the unbelievable. So before we start with the first point, let's just talk a little bit about Abraham and give some context to who he was. We know he is considered, and many have referenced him as the father of the faithful. He happens to be the father of the 3 big monotheistic religions. Judaism, Christianity, and even Islam consider him one of their founding fathers. He's a pivotal character in the Bible, and there are 12 chapters in Genesis dedicated to his life, from chapter 12 to 24. Chapter 25 speaks about his death and his burial. He's mentioned around 25 times in the New Testament and many more times in the Old Testament, of course. We know that he migrated with his father, Terah, from Ur to Haran. You know that he was with his father beyond the river, serving other gods, and we will reference later Joshua 24, 2 and 3 to highlight some of this nuance. God called him from the comfort of his home and the family in Mesopotamia to journey to a promised land. He was 75 years old when this journey started. He took everything he had, his family, his wife Sarai, who later was named Sarah, and his nephew Lot, and set out on this amazing journey that I would call funded by faith. God promised to multiply Abraham's offspring and to make him a blessing for all the nations of the earth. As he got even older, again, his journey started at 75, he had no children, so he decided, alongside with his wife, Sarah, and the situation that was in, that he was going to father a son through his wife's servant Hagar. and the son's name was Ishmael. This was a practice that was fairly common in those times. While his faith was generally strong, he often had a tendency to try to help God's promises happen a little quicker. It's sort of a human nature that he resembled, and I think we can relate to in many ways. This was, however, not the way that God wanted the promise to happen for him, not through Ishmael. And when he was about 100 years old, Sarah, who herself was very advanced of age, gave birth to a son, Isaac. We know that God renewed his promise to Abraham in many instances and made circumcision be the covenant of this promise, of his promise to him. And ultimately, Abraham was the first to be circumcised. God continued to test Abraham's faith. One of these most worthy instances being when God asked him to take his son Isaac to be sacrificed. And we have a whole sermon dedicated to this instance, I believe, next Sunday. As he was ready to sacrifice him, his son, God, in the last moment, and always this is a perfect time instance and situation with much of how Abraham interacted with and was under God's guidance, God intervened and stopped him. And in the end, we know that they sacrificed a ram that God provided again at the perfect time. Abraham was ultimately the father of many generations, has David in his lineage, and ultimately his lineage goes all the way to Jesus, which is the fulfillment and the promise that Abraham, will be indeed a blessing for all the nations. So, like I said, there's so much we can learn about Abraham and his life, but let's just quickly go to the 3 points that I've highlighted first. So the first point, faith changes lives. Faith in God Almighty, the true and only God, the creator of everything that exists, does indeed change lives. We see this very much reflected in Abraham and his life. In Joshua 24:2, we learn that Abraham, his father, and all his family were worshippers of idols and false gods. And the verse reads, "And Joshua said to all the people, 'Thus say the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, and they served other gods.'" Faith changed Abraham's life and the life of those around him. His family, his servants, everyone and everything around him was impacted by his faith and God's calling to him. Abraham's faith directly impacted Sarah, his wife, and her faith. Would she have developed in this amazing woman of faith, a strong woman of faith, if it wasn't for Abraham and for the influence that he had in her life? So ultimately, does your faith as a Christian and how you go about your life positively impact the faith of your wife, your husband, the family, and all those around you? Faith changed Abraham's priorities in the course of his life. Have your priorities changed when God called you and asked you to be his follower? Have my priorities changed? Do I prioritize and follow God above all else? Or do I occasionally, prioritize my desires or the outing with the kids or the soccer practice or something else other than being in God's presence and with God's people? I know we all know many amazing stories and examples of people who live and whose lives have been drastically changed by God. We should definitely find power and inspiration in these stories and these sometimes miraculous stories. But tonight, right now, I want each one of us to think about how our faith, our individual personal faith, is reflected in our lives and the lives of those around us. Do people see in us as that we are echoing God and that our faith strengthens the people that are around us? Are they impacted by our faith? Faith embraces God's promise, and for Abraham, there were 3 promises that we know. Promises that were not just for him, not just for the Jewish people even, but promises that are for us and apply to us here today. First is the first promise is a nation promise. The nation of Israel is ultimately what we're talking about here. And we know that it took 500 plus years for this promise to ultimately materialize and come to life. How patient are we when God speaks to us and promises something to us? Most often than not, especially today in the age of technology and fast-moving everything, we expect stuff to happen within minutes, if not seconds. Abraham did not live to see the promise fulfilled, this specific promise fulfilled, but his faith did not die. A nation ultimately can exist without land, and this is really kind of connects into the next part of the three-part promise that we received, which is a land promise. Land really means blessings. During those times especially, and even today, you have land, you're in good shape. You can make something out of it. For the Jewish people specifically, not having land or not being on the land that was promised was considered almost shameful, almost a little bit of a curse. And this was ultimately another promise that took some time to be fulfilled, but was later fulfilled, and as we know, is captured in the Old Testament. And Joshua 21:43 notes, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there." And then the third promise, the third part of this promise, was ultimately a spiritual promise. Abraham, during his life, was a blessing to many people that he encountered. I'm sure he saw that his life, as God said, was being, as his life was being changed by his faith, he had the ability to influence and be a blessing for those around him. I'm, however, wondering if he had any expectations on a sort of personal level that the complete fulfillment of being a blessing for all nations was going to happen during his lifetime, and he was going to witness this. You know, in any case, I have faith that, in any case, his faith, I believe, carried him forward with strong momentum. This specific promise that he will be a blessing for all nations took 2 millennia, 2,000 years or so to be fulfilled. And it happened ultimately when Jesus was born. Through Jesus, the grandson of Abraham, through lineage, every person and every nation can receive salvation and be blessed. God really, ultimately, never really meant for to create a selfish religious nation out of Abraham's offspring, focus on rituals and the mechanics of religion. He chose Abraham, chose the Jewish people, and ultimately chose and changed you and me to be a blessing for all the nations and for all the people around us. It's noteworthy that, you know, Abraham's age, as I said earlier, when God called him was 75, as well as his age that when Isaac was born was also very advanced. So it goes to prove that God's time and the timeline that he works is rarely what we humans expect it to be. And then in God's eyes, really there are no age restrictions. You and I can be great and used by God at any age. You're never too young nor too old to be used by God and to really fulfill his works. Faith in God changes us and makes us a blessing for all those who we meet, and has the ability to impact and change lives many generations later, as we see with Abraham. We need to be strong in our faith, have patience, and let God work in our lives and the lives of those around us. Now, the second point, faith is a journey. For Abraham, this journey started when God called him. I really like how God's calling for him is, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I can understand it, very crisp and clear. And in Genesis 12:1, we read, "Now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." In my opinion, there's no room for confusion and misinterpretation. God didn't ask Abraham to maybe move within the town or maybe just, go out of town, move to the suburbs. He was very clear that he is to leave his family, his people, and the land he is currently in. No confusion, crisp, clear, concise. And I believe that when God speaks to us, he does so in a very clear way. We can tell when a word we receive is from God based on how clear and actionable it is for us individually. Now, when it comes to a journey, we either move forward and grow in our faith and get closer to God, or we slip and go backwards. There's no standing still. Standing still is not an option. Imagine as if you're hiking up a tough mountain. If you stop going up, you most certainly start sliding down. Maybe for a moment or two, when you stop, you think you got your footing and you can kind of stand still. But the reality is that your footing will get lost and you start to slide down and you potentially even roll back and get really hurt. Our faith is a journey much the same way. Faith keeps on moving forward. It doesn't always mean geographical movement, as it did for Abraham, but it can. There are people that are called to move to Africa, to go on mission trips across the world. It is ultimately, for most of us, a spiritual move. As we move forward in our faith, we grow spiritually. You know, Abraham's journey started ultimately in Ur. Kind of halfway point was Haran, where God spoke to him. And then ultimately, he made it to Canaan. Where are you on your spiritual journey is the question that I want you to ask yourself today. Are you in the beginning of your spiritual journey? Maybe you have not even started yet. Where am I in my spiritual journey? Are you happy? Maybe somewhere in the middle, you know, being a mediocre Christian, used to compromising and kind of generally being comfortable just blending in? You know, it's a question that is very personal, and I need to be honest with myself as you do with yourself. We need to keep moving forward in our faith, and changing friends sometimes is the thing that we need to do. Sometimes we need to leave a sin behind, something that we do and we know it's wrong. Making a big, bold move sometimes is required, or a decision to really make a drastic change. Every one of us knows in a very personal way what is keeping us from moving individually forward in our faith. We need to listen to God's calling and leave behind whatever it is that is keeping us from going forward and from growing in our faith. You know, another interesting nuance about this aspect of faith being a journey, and specifically as it relates to Abraham, was that faith is quick to obey. We know that in many of the instances, as you read the story of Abraham, and I encourage you to do it, you know, from chapter 12 to 24, not only is it an empowering a story that, you know, will give you good spiritual strength, but it's actually quite captivating and entertaining. Lots of movies have been made around it. But Abraham, we see that in most instances, he acted very swiftly, often on the same day after God called him to do something. You know, in Genesis 17:23, for example, we read, "Then Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all those born in his house, or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him." I'm not going to go into the details of, you know, what circumcision is and whatnot. Obviously, it's an interesting procedure, but imagine that decision that he had to make, that was going to happen that day, and how many people were ultimately impacted, and he had to put that action in place that day. He didn't like dwell on it and just like, okay, God kind of told me this thing. It's an interesting ask. I'm not sure I understand it. I'm going to sleep on it a little bit and take my time with it. No, as soon as God spoke to him, as soon as he understood that the message was clear from God to him, he acted on it. And that's a lesson that I really believe we can apply in our lives and in our spiritual growth and spiritual journey. In Psalm 119:60, we read, "I hasten and do not delay to keep your commandments." And this is, you know, a word that I think you find through a lot of the Bible characters, the titans of the faith. They listened and they followed God and God's calling immediately. Did not dwell on it, did not allow for opportunities to reimagine and rethink how else to tackle it. We tend to procrastinate and obey the easy commands first. But moving forward, you know, let us be quick to listen and obey God no matter what the calling is, no matter what He's asking us to do. When we know He's asking us to do something, let's do it quickly. When God speaks to you, as He did to Abraham, and His word for you is clear, and it was for Abraham, jump on the opportunity to fulfill His calling and to continue your spiritual journey. You know the expression, somebody says jump, you say how high. This is an instance where that applies. God tells you to jump, you jump right away. The last point of my sermon is that faith believes the unbelievable. As I said earlier, Abraham was very old when God spoke to him and told him he will be a blessing for all the nations and ultimately a great man. His age was advanced. 75. I think I said it a number of times now. And the odds were very much against him as he still had the capability of achieving great things. Yet he believed, unbelievable from the people's perspective, but the very much believable from God's perspective. You know, when Isaac was born and when he was about 100 years old, Abraham, and then for 25 more years after that point, before he died, Abraham continued to do amazing things and to believe the unbelievable, to trust in God, and to let God work in his life. It was his faith in God and his faith in believing that ultimately was credited to him as righteousness. And Romans 4, verses 1 to 3 read, "What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." And you probably know that this is a reference to Genesis 15:6. So the question then is, how strong is your faith? Do we still believe the promises that God made us maybe many years ago that will still come true? Is our faith starting to be shaky and maybe it's losing us a little bit of the power to keep us going forward? I hope that isn't the case. But if it is, we can look at Abraham, we can learn about how he moved forward and how the belief in the unbelievable that he had kept him moving forward and advancing in his spiritual journey and in growing spiritually. Abraham believed the unbelievable and trusted God with everything that he had, his own life, the life of his family, and everything that he possessed. He trusted God with what he had as his most precious possessions. Are we willing to trust God with what is most precious in our lives? Abraham, as we know, lived in a dangerous time, in a dangerous part of the world, yet he lived by faith, not by fear. Do we do the same, or do we sometimes let fear take us over? I was driving home the other day and I was thinking, and this happens sometimes, probably not just to me. What happens if electricity goes down? I know a friend that, installed a nice generator. I don't have one. I could maybe survive a few days, but what do I do afterwards? Then my mind kind of started going to, I have this wood that I'm probably going to chop. We're going to keep warm for a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. And then I kept going down this path of thinking that, I can figure it out. I can somehow survive. But then in the end, thank God, a thought came over me and I pretty much realized that I cannot live in fear that what will happen, no matter what. If it's not electricity, it's the water. If it's not the water, it's the medicine that we depend on one way or another. Ultimately, it is God who we need to put our faith in and believe that he will take care of us. And that's the only thing that matters. Do we do the same as Abraham did in his life? Do I trust God and have faith in his promises for me, even when we only have a partial understanding of it, of his plan for us? It's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it is what we're called to do. I'm personally in the circumstances where, I believe God has told me to wait in my professional situation. And, it's not really an easy thing to do. I keep wanting to, maybe if not open the doors myself, at least be ready. So look for the doors, where the doors will open. But I do believe that ultimately God has asked me to stay put. And I'm going to wait for him to just take me to the next step, the next journey, the next door to open when the time is right. And I believe that this is maybe a situation or an instance that many of us can relate to. Waiting for God patiently and having faith that his will for us will ultimately benefit us is how we need to approach our life and our belief and our spiritual journey. So in closing, I pray that Abraham's life is an example for us of how we need to live our life in faith. I pray that our faith in God changes our life and the lives of those around us today, and why not for many generations to come. It's so awesome when I hear in reference in sermons and in conversations about our grandparents and their grandparents and the fathers of our Romanian belief in, those that founded churches back in the country in Romania. And look, we are today in some ways a result of their faith and a result of them walking close to God at those times. I pray that we, in our turn, have the opportunity to impact, and our actions today will reflect positively and will strengthen the faith of generations to come. I pray that God speaks to us and helps us understand His calling clearly. It's important, so that we can quickly take actions that will propel us further in our spiritual growth as we seek to become more and more like Jesus. And finally, I pray that God gives us the ability to believe the unbelievable, to live by faith, not by fear, and to be active participants in His salvation plan for the rest of the world. Amen.